The hospital monitors beeped steadily as I sat beside my mother's bed, watching her chest rise and fall with each shallow breath. The chemotherapy was taking its toll, but her doctors remained optimistic. Stage 2 breast cancer, caught early, the prognosis was good. If only I could say the same about Richard's intentions. Emily, he said, placing his hand on my shoulder. You should go home and rest. I'll stay with your mother tonight. My name is Emily Chen, and at 32, I was watching my stepfather systematically dismantle my family's legacy while my mother fought for her life. I'm fine, I replied, shrugging off his touch. The nurses said she might wake up soon. Richard Marshall had entered our lives 5 years ago, sweeping my mother off her feet with his charm and seemingly endless knowledge of fine wine and classical music. A perfect match for Claire Chen, respected curator of the city's most prestigious art museum and widow of one of the country's most successful real estate developers. My father had left us well provided for when he passed. The Chen family fortune included properties across 3 continents, an art collection that rivaled small museums, and enough liquid assets to ensure neither of us would ever want for anything. Now, as I watched Richard fidget with his Rolex, bought with my mother's money, of course, I remembered the conversation I'd overheard 3 days ago, the one that had changed everything. I'd stopped by the house to pick up some things for Mom when I heard Richard's voice from his study, sharp and irritated. Listen, Marcus, this has to be done carefully, he'd said. Once I have power of attorney, we can start moving assets, but it has to look legitimate. I'd frozen in the hallway, my heart pounding. The daughter? Please, Emily's too wrapped up in her mother's illness to notice anything. By the time Claire finishes her treatment, everything will be safely transferred. And if something unfortunate should happen before then, well, that would simplify things considerably. That night, I'd gone home and ordered the recording equipment, tiny, sophisticated devices that would catch every word, every plan, every betrayal. The next morning, I'd started wearing them constantly, building my case piece by piece. Now, watching him hover over my mother's hospital bed like a concerned husband, I felt my phone heavy in my pocket, capturing every moment. The lawyer will be here tomorrow morning, Richard said, adjusting Mom's blanket with false tenderness. Just some routine paperwork to help me manage things while Claire focuses on getting better. I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. What time? I'd like to be here. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face. That's not necessary, Emily. Your mother and I have discussed this. She trusts me to handle everything. Of course she trusted him. My mother, brilliant as she was with art and culture, had always been naive when it came to matters of the heart. After my father died, she'd thrown herself into her work, curating exhibitions and building the museum's reputation. Then Richard had appeared, with his perfectly tailored suits and vast knowledge of Renaissance art. Still, I said, forcing a smile, I'd like to be here, for Mom's sake. He couldn't argue without revealing his hand. Fine, 10 o'clock. The night passed slowly. I pretended to doze in my chair while Richard made phone calls in the hallway, my recording devices catching every word. Names of offshore accounts, transfer instructions, plans for emergency sales of key assets. Around midnight, Mom stirred. Emily, she whispered, her voice weak from the treatments. He's been so wonderful through all of this, and I know you've never quite warmed to him, but she paused, catching her breath. I need to know you two can work together. For me. I felt tears prick at my eyes. I was at her side instantly. I'm here, Mom. Her eyes fluttered open, still bright despite everything. Where's Richard? Making some calls about the museum, I lied smoothly. How are you feeling? Tired, she admitted, but the doctors say the treatment is working. I squeezed her hand gently. That's great news. Emily, she said, her grip surprisingly strong, I need you to promise me something. Anything. Let Richard help. Don't worry about that now, Mom. Just focus on getting better. She smiled weakly. You're so much like your father, always protecting me. If only she knew how right she was. Later, after Mom had drifted back to sleep and Richard had returned to his chair, I excused myself to use the bathroom. In the harsh fluorescent light, I checked my recording devices, making sure everything was working properly. Then I sent a carefully encrypted file to James Wong, my father's former lawyer and the one person I knew I could trust. More evidence, I typed. How much more do we need? His response came quickly. Keep recording. We need to establish a clear pattern of intent. How's your mother? Doctors are optimistic. Treatment's working. Good. Stay strong, Emily. Your father would be proud. I stared at those words for a long moment. Dad had always taught me to be prepared, to think 3 steps ahead. In business and in life, he'd say, the person who anticipates trouble is the one who survives it. When I returned to Mom's room, Richard was on the phone again, speaking quietly in the corner. Yes, everything's set for tomorrow, he murmured. Once I have power of attorney, we can begin phase 1. The art collection first. It's the easiest to liquidate. My hand clenched around my phone. The art collection, my mother's life's work, pieces she'd spent decades curating. He was planning to sell it off piece by piece. Emily, he said, noticing me. I thought you'd gone home. Just stepped out for some air, I replied, settling back into my chair. Hard to sleep in hospitals. He nodded sympathetically, but I caught the flash of irritation in his eyes. My presence was complicating his plans. Good. The next morning dawned gray and cold. I changed into fresh clothes and grabbed coffee from the hospital cafeteria, wanting to be sharp for what was coming. The lawyer, not our family's usual counsel, but someone Richard had chosen, arrived promptly at 10. Mrs. Chen, he said, nodding to my mother who was propped up in bed. How are you feeling? Well enough to sign some papers, she smiled weakly. Richard explained everything. I watched carefully as the lawyer laid out the documents. Power of attorney forms, transfer authorizations, documents that would give Richard complete control over every aspect of my mother's finances. Now, the lawyer began, these forms will grant Mr. Marshall full authority to manage your affairs while you focus on your recovery. I noticed he didn't mention how broad these powers were, how difficult they would be to revoke. Mom, I said carefully, maybe we should have James look these over first. He's handled our family's legal matters for years. Richard's jaw tightened. James is retired, Emily, and your mother doesn't need the stress of dealing with multiple lawyers right now. It's fine, sweetheart, Mom said, patting my hand. I trust Richard. Those words, I trust Richard, made my stomach turn. But I kept my face neutral as I watched her sign paper after paper, recording every moment. As the lawyer gathered the signed documents, I saw Richard's shoulders relax slightly. He thought he'd won. But I had 3 months of chemotherapy treatments ahead of us. 3 months to gather evidence, to build my case, to protect what my father had spent his life building. Richard had no idea what was coming. That afternoon, after Mom had fallen asleep again, I met James at a small coffee shop 3 blocks from the hospital. The place was nearly empty, perfect for sensitive conversations. I've reviewed the recordings, he said without preamble. It's damning, but we need more. Specifically, we need proof that he's actually moving assets, not just talking about it. I sipped my coffee, thinking, he'll start with the art collection. It's worth millions, and he knows enough about art to make the sales look legitimate. James nodded. Can you get access to his computer? His emails? Better, I smiled. I have Mom's passwords to all the accounts. She gave them to me years ago after Dad died. Richard doesn't know. Good. Document everything. Every transfer, every sale, every conversation. We need to build an airtight case. And Mom's cancer treatments? The doctors are optimistic. I nodded. 3 months of chemo, then surgery. They caught it early. Then we have time, James said, his eyes hard. Time to catch this bastard before he can do any real damage. As I drove back to the hospital, I thought about everything at stake. It wasn't just about the money, though the Chen fortune was substantial. It was about protecting my mother's legacy, my father's hard work, everything our family had built. Richard might think he was clever, taking advantage of my mother's illness to steal our fortune, but he'd made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated how far our daughter would go to protect her family. The next few weeks passed in a blur of hospital visits and careful surveillance. True to my predictions, Richard wasted no time putting his plans into motion. I watched through my remote access to Mom's accounts as he began orchestrating the sales of her art collection. First to go was a small Monet. Just to cover medical expenses, he told Mom when she noticed it missing from their living room. She'd been too tired from the chemotherapy to question it further. But I documented everything. Every transfer, every sale, every investment opportunity that somehow always ended up benefiting accounts in Richard's name. Look at this, I said to James one evening, showing him my laptop screen. We were meeting in his home office, away from prying eyes. He sold nearly $12 million worth of art in 3 weeks. James adjusted his glasses, studying the transactions. And the money. Transferred through 4 different shell companies before landing in an account in the Cayman Islands. I pulled up another document, an account registered to a corporation he created 2 months ago. Right around the time your mother's cancer was diagnosed, James noted grimly. Exactly. I sat back, running my hands through my hair. He's been planning this from the beginning. But Richard wasn't content with just the art collection. 2 days later, I caught him on recording discussing the sale of our family's commercial properties with a real estate agent. The owner is indisposed, he'd said smoothly, but I have full authority to handle the transactions. That night, I met with Marcus Chen, no relation, the property manager my father had trusted for 20 years. He's trying to sell the entire portfolio, Marcus confirmed, looking troubled. At well below market value, rush sales, all cash deals. Can you stall him? Marcus smiled. Already am. Every potential buyer seems to run into unexpected complications with their financing. I squeezed his hand gratefully. Thank you, we just need to hold him off a little longer. Meanwhile, Mom's treatments were progressing well. Her doctors were pleased with her response to the chemotherapy, and her surgery was scheduled for the following month. You're getting stronger every day, I told her during one of our morning visits. She smiled weakly. Thanks to you and Richard. I don't know what I'd do without you both. The mention of Richard made my jaw clench, but I kept my voice light. Have you seen the latest museum newsletter? They're doing a special exhibition of Impressionist works. Oh? She perked up slightly. Which pieces? They mentioned that Monet you love so much. I saw the confusion cross her face. But Richard said he'd moved that to storage for safekeeping. Did he? I asked carefully, my phone recording every word. Yes, she frowned. At least I think that's what he said. The medications sometimes make things fuzzy. I held her hand, feeling the anger burn in my chest. This was how he'd been doing it, taking advantage of her medication-induced confusion to explain away the disappearing artwork. That evening, I received an urgent text from James. Check your email. Now, the email contained documents from one of Richard's offshore accounts, complete records of his transactions and future plans. How did you get these? I asked when I called him. Let's just say Richard isn't the only one with connections in the banking world, James replied. Emily, this is worse than we thought. He's not just stealing assets, he's taken out loans against your mother's properties. If he defaults, she could lose everything. I felt my blood run cold. How much time do we have? Based on these documents, 2 weeks before the first loan comes due. I glanced at my calendar. Mom's surgery was scheduled for next week. If all went well, she'd be in recovery for several days after that. We need to move faster, I said. Can you set up a meeting with Judge Harrison? The evidence we have will be enough. I cut him off. It has to be. The next few days were a careful dance of hospital visits and legal preparations. I managed to get copies of every fraudulent document Richard had created, every transfer he'd authorized, every sale he'd arranged. The evidence mounted, painting a clear picture of calculated theft. But Richard was getting suspicious. I caught him watching me more closely, especially when I was on my phone or laptop. You've been spending a lot of time with your mother's accounts, he commented one evening at the hospital. I met his gaze steadily. Just trying to stay organized. Mom taught me the importance of keeping good records. His eyes narrowed slightly, but he said nothing more. The day before Mom's surgery, I made my move. I'd arranged for Judge Harrison, an old friend of my father's, to hold an emergency hearing. The evidence is compelling, the judge said, reviewing our documentation. Multiple instances of fraud, unauthorized transfers, clear intent to deceive. Mr. Marshall appears to have systematically abused his power of attorney. We're requesting an immediate freeze on all accounts and transactions, James stated, and an emergency revocation of the power of attorney. Judge Harrison nodded gravely. Granted, and given the severity of these charges, I'm also issuing a temporary restraining order. Mr. Marshall is not to contact Mrs. Chen or access any of her accounts or properties. I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. But this was just the beginning. The next morning, as Mom was being prepped for surgery, Richard arrived at the hospital looking smug. "Emily," he said, barely acknowledging me. "I've arranged to move some more assets to cover the medical bills." "No," I cut him off. "You haven't." He blinked. "Excuse me?" I stood facing him directly. "Your power of attorney has been revoked. Your access to all accounts has been frozen. And in about 30 seconds, 2 federal agents are going to walk through that door with some questions about your creative banking practices." As if on cue, 2 suited figures appeared in the doorway, badges visible. "Mr. Marshall," one of them said, "we need you to come with us." The color drained from his face. "This is ridiculous. I have authorization to steal millions from my mother while she fights cancer." I pulled out my phone, playing one of his recorded conversations. "To sell her art collection, to take out fraudulent loans against her properties. You recorded me. Every word, every plan, every betrayal." I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "Did you really think I'd let you destroy everything my parents built?" The agents moved forward, but Richard held up his hands. "Wait, Emily, we can work something out. Your mother, she needs me." "No," I said firmly. "She needs chemotherapy, which she's gotten. She needs surgery, which she's about to have. What she doesn't need is a thief pretending to be a loving husband while stealing everything she has." As the agents led him away, I saw Mom being wheeled towards surgery. She was still groggy from pre-op medications, unaware of the drama unfolding. "Everything okay?" she asked sleepily, noticing my expression. I squeezed her hand. "Everything's fine, Mom. Focus on getting better. I'll handle everything else." The surgery was successful. While Mom recovered in post-op, I worked with James to begin undoing the damage Richard had caused. Most of the art collection was recovered. He hadn't had time to move the more valuable pieces. The property loans were invalidated due to fraud. The offshore accounts were frozen and their contents returned. A week later, as Mom was being discharged from the hospital, I finally told her everything. I showed her the evidence, played the recordings, explained how Richard had tried to steal her fortune while she was vulnerable. She was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then, to my surprise, she smiled. "You know," she said softly, "your father always said you were the smart one. Emily sees everything, he'd tell me, just like her mother. I should have seen Richard for what he was. But you protected us both." Tears filled my eyes. "I couldn't let him take everything you and Dad built." "No," she agreed, taking my hand. "You built something better. You built justice." In the end, Richard pleaded guilty to multiple counts of fraud. The evidence was too overwhelming to fight. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison and ordered to repay everything he'd stolen. The art collection was restored to its rightful place. The properties remained secure, and most importantly, Mom's latest scans showed no sign of cancer. One evening, months later, Mom and I stood in her gallery, looking at the recovered Monet, the first piece Richard had tried to steal. "You know what your father would say about all this?" she asked. I shook my head. "He'd say, never underestimate a Chen woman." She turned to me, her eyes bright. "He'd be so proud of you, Emily. So am I." As we stood there, surrounded by the art she'd spent a lifetime collecting, I thought about everything that had happened. Richard had seen us as easy targets, a sick woman and her distracted daughter. He'd never understood that sometimes the quietest people are the most dangerous. He tried to steal our fortune, but in doing so, he'd given us something more valuable. The knowledge that we were stronger than any betrayal, any illness, any attempt to break us. And that was worth more than all the art in the world.